I read Richard Nixon's book, No More Vietnams, and it convinced me that Vietnam was necessary and just. And that was, and I just followed that. I was very much an interventionist for several years. I was a young kid. And then after I observed, the 1990s and then certainly the War on Terror, then retrospectively, I look back at the way I thought about these other conflicts and I began to think, maybe that was also unwise. So in other words, the bad experiences we've had in more recent foreign policy made me rethink my opinions about earlier ones. Have you had that experience, and where did you stand during the Cold War?
Well, first of all, a lot of the Cold War I spent standing in uniform, so I was never asked for my opinion. But before I went into the military, and that was 1971 when I went to VMI, the view in my household was very divided. I remember that my mother took the position that we had to support the troops in Vietnam. My maternal grandfather, who had been in the First World War and hated Woodrow Wilson and concluded early on that that war had been a total mistake, turned to her and would say repeatedly, well, if you want to support the troops, get them the hell out of Vietnam and bring them home. He was right.
As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So a U.S. drone strike targeting a vehicle in Baghdad on Wednesday killed 3 members of Kateb Hezbollah, including a high-ranking commander. And this is the latest U.S. escalation in Iraq. So Kateb Hezbollah, we've been covering them quite a bit lately. They're a Shia militia in Iraq. They're one of the bigger militias, and they are part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is a coalition of Iraqi militias that was founded in 2014 to fight ISIS. Kateb Hezbollah has been around since 2003, since the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But the PMF, which is part of Iraq's security forces, part of the Iraqi military, and that's who the U.S. is killing and bombing here. So a PMF official identified the slain Kateb Hezbollah commander as Abu Bakr al-Sadi, and U.S. Central Command released a statement confirming that the U.S. was behind the drone strike. When this news first broke, it wasn't clear. I mean, I think it was pretty obvious that it was a U.S. drone strike, but there wasn't any comment from the U.S. at the time. So CENTCOM said the assassination was in response to attacks on U.S. troops in the region. The command claimed that al-Sadi was responsible for attacks on U.S. troops. CENTCOM said that its forces, quote, conducted a unilateral strike in Iraq in response to the attacks on U.S. service members, killing a Kateb Hezbollah commander responsible for directly planning and participating in attacks on U.S. forces in the region, end quote. And of course, they're not going to show us any evidence of these allegations. We're just supposed to take the U.S. military's word for it. And this drone strike has outraged a lot of people inside Iraq, and it sparked protests near the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. And according to AP, Iraqi security forces have closed off Baghdad's green zone, which is where most of the foreign embassies and diplomatic missions are located. And there were protesters. There was calls for protesters to storm the U.S. embassy. Doesn't look like anything like that happened yet, but this really angers a lot of people inside Iraq. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a counter-offer from Hamas on a potential hostage deal, insisting that he will settle for nothing less than total victory. So according to Middle East Eye, Hamas proposed a 135-day ceasefire in 3 45-day phases with the goal of reaching a permanent truce. During the first phase, Hamas would release all the women, children, elderly, and sick Israeli hostages that remain in Gaza. And when it comes to the women, the ones that were not soldiers. And then in exchange, they want Israel to release all the Palestinian women, children, sick, and elderly prisoners over 50 years old from Israeli prisons, and an additional 1,500 Palestinian prisoners. They're asking for a lot of Palestinian prisoners to be released. I know in one case, I want to say it was in 2011. I might not have the year right. Hamas had a captive Israeli soldier, and they got over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for just the one soldier. So there is a precedent for them to get a lot of Palestinians freed, but that's more for soldiers. And then throughout the next phases, Hamas would release all the Israeli soldiers and men that it still has hostage. And Israel would release an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners during that time. So the goal by the end of the 135 days would be to reach an agreement on a permanent cessation of hostilities. So when asked if Israel has formally rejected Hamas's offer, Netanyahu said, quote, based on what they passed to us from what I've seen so far, you too would have said no, end quote. He said there's no solution besides total victory, and claimed an Israeli victory is within reach. And of course, as I've been covering a lot lately, Hamas is not anywhere close to being eradicated, as Netanyahu says he wants them to be. They're popping up back in the north. So Israel still has a very long way to go. TVBS, which is a Taiwanese news station, TV news station, they have reported that U.S. military advisors have been deployed to Kinmen, which is a group of small islands that are controlled by Taiwan, but are located just off the coast of mainland China. And when I say just off the coast, I mean just off the coast. If you see this map here, it gives you the perspective of where Kinmen is related to mainland China. I mean, it's right on the coast. And this is a story I logged onto Twitter or X this morning, and I saw this, people tweeting about this, and I said, no, there's no way that's right. These people aren't that crazy. So then I saw this report in TVBS, and that's what it was based on. The tweets were based on, and I actually found an English language story that they have on it. And I said, let me ask the Pentagon, see what they say. And they replied to me actually pretty quickly, and they said that they could not comment on military operations in Taiwan. And that's kind of a stock answer that you get from the Pentagon. I've gotten that answer from them before when asking about U.S. military operations in Taiwan. But what it's not is it's not a denial. I asked them specifically, can you confirm that there are U.S. military advisors in Kinmen, right on the coast of mainland China? That's something, if they weren't doing it, you would think that they would want to say, no, that's a false report, but gave me this kind of, no, we don't comment on that. And this is the same thing they told me when the U.S. deployed about 200 troops to Taiwan last year, the same comment. And that's basically, been confirmed because that's how this stuff with Taiwan, that's how we find out about it, is through the Taiwanese media reports, because the U.S. and Taiwan don't want to officially announce this type of cooperation. But anyway, I'll read a little bit. The Pentagon spokesman who got back to me said, quote, "We don't have a comment on specific operations, engagements, or training, but I would highlight that our support for and defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China. Our commitment to Taiwan is rock solid," end quote. So when we talk about military advisors in Taiwan, that usually means U.S. Special Operations Forces. A lot of times they send Green Berets. So that's what we're talking about here. It didn't say how many of the advisors. It could just be a few dozen, but the fact that they're on Kinmen is crazy. Some of these islands are only 2.5 miles away from mainland China, from Xiamen, which is a major Chinese city that's right there. If you see pictures of these islands, on our front page right now, is the picture story is one of the Kinmen Islands, and you can see the skyline of Xiamen, the Chinese city that's spelled Xiamen, I believe, Xiamen. You can see the skyline there. That's how close they are.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
I want to begin this read by what you wrote here. Can big tech censor political and cultural voices on their platform? Can the government regulate these platforms to compel speech the government wants to hear and to prevent speech it believes may harm innocence? If you believe, as I do, in natural rights, minimal government and the owners of private property can use it as they see fit. The short answers to both questions is no. These questions arise from a vicious Senate inquisition last week, during which a senator who never met a war he didn't want someone else to fight accused Facebook and others of having blood on their hands because they permitted speech on their platforms that the senator believes led to teen suicides. I want to ask you, first of all, who is this senator?
Oh, you know him well because you were on live television on Fox News when you were blocked so that he could come on.
Oh, that
Senator.
Arrogant little boy who you were like loves every war, never could fight in one.
Correct.
Lindsey the loser Graham.
Correct.
So, Judge,
for him to say to Zuckerberg, "You have blood on your hands," where there isn't a human in the Senate at the moment who has more blood on his hands than Senator Graham, was just an outrageous abuse of government power. The government has no right to drag people before it and say, why did you say this? And why did you not say that? And why did you permit this speech? And why didn't you stop that speech? The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. Zuckerberg turned around, shaking. I don't know if it was real or exaggerated, almost in tears. I don't know if it was real or exaggerated. Looked in the faces of parents whose children killed themselves because the parents couldn't control the kids. And now these parents want the feds to do it for them, and said, "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." It was a disgraceful assault on the First Amendment. And yet Lindsey Graham was lauded and sympathy pours out for the parents. Of course, I have sympathy for any parent whose child dies. But this is an issue for parental control, not for the government. The last thing in the world you want is for the feds to decide what people can see and hear on their mobile devices. I thought of you this morning when I heard the local news that an appellate court in New Jersey, now this is the court system of which I was a part for 8 years, ruled against people at a Board of Education meeting during COVID who stood up to challenge the board's regulations of sending the kids home and forcing them to wear masks, and insisted on taking their masks off so that they could be heard at the Board of Education meeting. And the Board of Education said, no, you have to speak to us through the mask. And these people said, well, I can't be heard through the mask. The mask is an expression of opinion, and I'm not expressing the opinion of being pro-mask. I'm anti-mask, and I have the right to stand here and tell you that. They threw these people out. The people sued. The trial judge threw the lawsuit out, and the appellate court upheld throwing it out, saying you were told to wear the mask. You had no right not to. Now, this is 2 years after the fact because, cases get online and there were other cases ahead of it. But I just shook my head that judges could do something like this at the quintessential place for free speech, a town meeting, a Board of Education meeting. Don't you dare speak to me without your mask on. I thought of you immediately when I heard this on the news. The only facts I know are the ones that I just related to you. But this continues. This big government nonsense continues, Gerald, even 2 years after the so-called pandemic is over.
Here's the box with the masks, Judge.
Oh,
You ready? These masks do not eliminate exposure to the risk of any disease or infection. Right on the box. Right here for everybody to look at. These stupid little masks that everybody was wearing. And yet, they
forced us to wear them.
People were challenged and they lost. And you remember your friend over there, I forgot his name, that Judge Ratcliffe or Ratshit.
Oh, yeah, Jed Rakoff, yeah.
Telling the guy that he's not going to be pardoned until he can't leave the court unless he gets a vaccination.
Correct. He did do that. It's just terrible. And now, of course, we learned from Fauci, but you never know whether to believe him or not. But in a candid moment after he left office, when they asked him what was the scientific basis for the 6 feet apart, there was none. They made it up. Made it up. People went to jail because of this. Religious and political gatherings protected by the First Amendment were disrupted by police acting like they were Nazis in Germany in the mid-30s because of this 6 foot apart regulation. And then we learned afterwards it was made up out of thin air.
Yeah. And the majority of the people swallowed it. There was a lot of people that didn't. I had peace. You were here. We had freedom rallies. How hated I was for having a freedom rally. Oh, by the way, we all died from having that rally. Everybody there, we were all dead. Again,
did you hear from a single person who claimed to get sick because we took our masks off? No. In fact, as I recall it, it was an eruption of human freedom that we were all there talking about freedom with no masks on, on your private property, in your beautiful garden, private property. And the police were protecting us rather than interfering with us.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
If we don't help humanitarian aid to the starving Palestinians in Gaza, hundreds of thousands could starve. And the border, everyone says chaos. You just saw Speaker Johnson. He says chaos. We have to do something legislative a few months ago. Well, what has happened in answer to your question? So this is crucial for America. It's a turning point.
So non-mandatory. This is the key. At 4,000 over a 7-day period, non-mandatory. 5,000 over a 7-day period. Okay, now that becomes mandatory. And then 8,500 in a 1-day period, mandatory limitations. I mean, these are astronomical figures. We're talking about per day, not per month, per day.
History is going to look over our shoulders and say, did we rise to the occasion? To his credit, Mitch McConnell did. But too many Republicans, including Speaker Johnson, are just scared to death of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said he wants chaos.
This is the ultimate canard that they've been pushing, and I've seen Bill Maher was doing it on Friday. It's been every talking head on the left has been pushing this nonstop. Donald Trump doesn't want to fix because it's politically better for him if the border issue is an absolute nightmare. It's better for him politically. That's why the GOP is so afraid to vote for this. Look at the actual bill itself, though. $62 billion additional dollars when we're already almost to $200 billion in aid to Ukraine over the past 2 years. They want to strap another $62 billion, pushing it to $250 billion. $14 billion in military support for Israel, which obviously almost nobody on the GOP side, aside from Thomas Massie, actually opposes, but setting that aside, and then $10 billion in humanitarian aid for Gaza and Ukraine. Which, well, I certainly feel bad for the people of Gaza and for the people of Ukraine, for that matter. I am not interested in being robbed and forced to send aid to them. If you want to ask me to voluntarily do so, that's a different discussion. That's not what you're doing here. And then $5 billion for partners in the Indo-Pacific, which is almost certainly to bolster Taiwan, I would guess. I haven't read the 200-page bill, but that's you can guess. So basically what we're talking about, this bill is a military bill. This is a direct $100+ billion handout to the military-industrial complex. That's what this is. And it's packaged as being a border security bill. It's amazing, the obfuscation. When you just cut through the platitudes and the flowery language they use to name these things, you get to the reality that this is just a handout to Boeing and Lockheed Martin and whatever Blackwater is called today. I mean, just disastrous.
Donald Trump has said, well, wait till I become president. That'll take at least a year. Ukraine could be gone. The border will get much worse. War in the Middle East will get worse, maybe bringing us into it. He's doing it all for political reasons.
Now, what is the evidence that it would actually, the situation in the Middle East will get worse if we don't fund Israel as they wipe out the Palestinians? How could you really rationally argue that? I mean, is there anyone in America or on the planet really that thinks that that Hamas is going to recover and actually topple Israel? Like, does anybody actually believe that? I find it very hard to believe that anyone believes that. Now, what could happen? What would actually worsen the situation in the Middle East? Well, we just lost 3 U.S. troops because we have all of our bases over there, and a bunch of these people are very, very upset with us for funding Israel in their wipeout of Gaza. What would actually make the situation worse? Well, what would really make the situation worse is if we continue to fund Israel, regardless of what they do to the Palestinians, and the rest of the Arab nations in their perimeter decide that they've seen enough. Now, that's how you get a really bad situation. But they never talk about that, ever. Because they don't care. Because their goal is war.
And let me just say, will senators, the crucial question, the $64,000 question, the majority of Republican senators know this bill is the right thing to do. It's a compromise. I don't like everything in it. Neither does McConnell. But it's a compromise. That's the only way you get things important done in the Senate. We proved that 2 years ago in our bipartisan legislation. And will the senators drown out the political noise from Trump and his minions and do the right thing for America? It's a crucial question. History is looking down on every one of us right now.
Such a reprehensible, deceptive, duplicitous performance to try and propagandize the American people into thinking this is for our best interest. In what way is we're dealing with back-breaking inflation in America? Absolutely brutal inflation. Poor people are really on the brink. The middle class is almost entirely obliterated. Any concern for that? No. We have to pass this for the benefit of the American people, for our defense. It's an outright lie. It's not a word of it is true. There is no national interest in exacerbating the conditions in the Middle East by continuing to fund Israel as they do whatever the fuck they want to the people of Palestine. There is no American national interest. There is my interest, your interests are not in alignment with that. There is no national interest in continuing to provoke a potential world war or a nuclear war with Russia, or potentially driving that into an escalation where it does come head to head between NATO and Russia, or China, or Iran. There are so many different flashpoints that could pop off. None of this helps to alleviate that. So if you're going to talk about our national interests, it's just not in alignment with anything that I know to be my own interest. So that means that it's for something else's interest. In this case, the military-industrial complex, Israel, and just the war machine broadly. Because I don't even think it's for Ukraine's interest. I think whatever the fuck they were doing over in Ukraine, it's to continue to keep that hidden. That's really why it's in America's national interest, because of whatever they were working on in the laboratories over there. And I can't talk about it, so I'll just leave it there. That's the truth. These people are not your representatives. They are lying through their teeth. They have no concern for your well-being, financial or otherwise. They are absolutely sailing your children down the river. And you, I might add, because we're no longer just talking about in the future pain and suffering. We're talking about present day pain and suffering that the American people are dealing with because of their unbelievably disloyal action. I mean, let's just call it what it is. This is traitorous behavior. It is. I don't know how you can see it any other way.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
I know that I've noticed that a lot of people who, let's say, describe themselves as America First, they'll say that a lot of the alleged threats to the U.S. are overblown and a lot of the interventions are unjustified. But they change their tune when it comes to China. They say China is a real threat. So what do you think the real truth of the matter is? In what sense is China a threat to the U.S. or otherwise?
Well, I've never bought that argument ever. But if you look at China today, which is in very serious economic crisis, its shadow banking system has finally been exposed. The corruption has just engulfed everyone in China. That's why Xi spends all this time rounding up generals and admirals in the army and the navy and imprisoning them. That's why he's imprisoning all sorts of so-called corporate leaders. China's a mess. A lot of the people that are now pouring into our country are single young men from China. Well, large numbers of them were wanted by the authorities for criminal behavior inside China. Not criminal behavior in the violent sense, but white-collar crime. embezzling, stealing, cheating on a whole range of topics. China has always had the problem of being too large, too big to govern. They can't barely manage themselves. The other thing is that the Chinese historically are not a great military power. Military power and the military profession are not really held in high esteem. What they want is a force that can protect them. They think they deserve that. But as far as invading somebody else's country, no. They tried that against the Vietnamese after the Vietnam War, and what happened to them? The Vietnamese crushed them. The Japanese, the Mongols, the Tartars, all of these people historically and Europeans have crushed China mercilessly. There's no threat from China. If we leave China alone, there are enough other actors in the region that the Chinese are not going to put themselves at risk. Japan is an enormously powerful state that never gets attention in the United States. The Japanese armed forces are superb. I would argue better than our own. So, the bottom line is, no, there is no threat from China. However, if you are in Asia and you ask the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the people that border China what the threat from China is, they'll say it's Chinese. If you let Chinese into your country, they come in, they colonize you, they take over your business sector, and then they bring in women and they peddle their women to the locals, and suddenly within a generation, you're no longer Vietnamese, Japanese, or Korean, you're just Chinese. In other words, they fear the population overwhelming them in the region. So you look at the border between North Korea and China. The Chinese want to keep the North Koreans out, but the North Koreans don't want anything to do with the Chinese. They're afraid that if the Chinese come into their country again, as they did during the Korean War, they'll never leave. They'll have millions of Chinese and they will cease to exist. The Manchus were a Mongol Turkic people in Manchuria. They cease to exist because they have, quote unquote, been Sinified. This is not a new phenomenon. This is how China has expanded. You move in and your population overwhelms the indigenous people, destroys their ethnicity, destroys their culture, their identity. That's the danger that people in Asia fear. They don't fear the economic danger. They want to be part of the Chinese market. They want to do business with them. They certainly don't fear the Chinese military.
You think there is a genuine prospect of anything other than skirmishes with Iran?
Not at the moment, but I would say that if you go back to 2001, the Iranians poured into the streets. 1 million of them demonstrated the night after 9/11, holding candles to memorialize our losses on 9/11. And the Iranians treated 9/11 as an opportunity for some measure of reconciliation and cooperation with us. Incidentally, so did the Russians. The Russians actually created and established a memorial to us that you can find. The bottom line is that everything failed when the neocon, I think his name is who wrote George Bush's speech for him, described the axis of evil. And in Berlin in particular, I had a lot of friends over there, Americans and Germans who were journalists. When they listened to the axis of evil, it included Iran and so forth. Everybody just said, oh my God, what a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
I think this Iranian obsession in the United States is entirely a function of Israel. And the Israelis have, obsessed over Iran for a very long time. When I was over there in 2020, and on my previous visits, I tried to explore the possibility of some sort of come to Jesus moment between Israel and Iran. And many of the Israelis privately admitted that, there really ought to be, because Israel, the United States, and Iran all have much more in common than they appreciate. Iran should not be our opponent or their opponent. But there was ultimately no willingness whatsoever in the leadership of Israel to even contemplate it. And so I think you have to understand, when you look at the American media and the financial sector and the power of the Israel lobby, its agents in the United States, the American people have been systematically brainwashed into believing this nonsense that Iran is evil incarnate and responsible for everything that's bad in the region. Everybody forgets that after Trump was elected and he went after ISIS, that the Iranians, in particular the Shiite militias that had been equipped and trained by the Iranians in Iraq and Syria, all went after ISIS with a vengeance. The Russians, of course, chimed in and bombed the living daylights out of the ISIS chapters all over Syria and Iraq. All of that seems to have been either ignored or forgotten. And as soon as, they got Iran back on the agenda for destruction. And I think what Israel wants is for us to destroy Iran. And right now, given the level of power and influence that Mr. Netanyahu has in Washington, I think there's a very high probability that they may get what they want. Now, that's not to say that we can attack with impunity, we won't take any losses, or that Iran will go down. Things have changed a lot. Iran is much more sophisticated now, much better armed, and has friends and allies that will help it. So, obviously, I'm somebody that thinks the idea of attacking Iran is a very dumb one and unnecessary. But that's not the conventional wisdom in Washington or in the media.
So this is so Biden is off the hook. His dog was chewing up his classified stuff, no problem. But the opinions of the Justice's Office of Legal Counsel don't rule out charges against a former president, however. Trump was hit with such an indictment last June, accusing him of willfully retaining classified information. So Trump was charged with that and obstruction of justice, and further charges were added in July. But Biden doing the same thing, maybe on a different scale. We don't know the whole details. No problem.
they will follow that up, and we'll find how to, if he pulls that one off.
Yeah.
But I keep asking questions, but it wouldn't be appropriate for the current event or the current number of people in Washington. I say, who cares? Why don't they make it where there is no such thing as classification unless you have an active war going on?
Yeah.
A real declared war, and for strategic reason. But the record should be available. And I just think that why do they worry this much about it? And then what are they going to do with it? We've seen boxes on both sides. Well, look at the boxes and stuff there. What are they going to do with it?
Yeah.
They're not going to sit and read it.
Yeah.
I was thinking, if they're going to write their memoirs, maybe they'd have probably a right to look at it.
Yeah.
To do that. But this whole thing is a bit crazy, and I just think that the document deal doesn't make any sense, and yet Trump is being held to this. Well, you're in trouble. That's one case that's still ongoing too.
Yeah, I remember when you were in office, you didn't want to go to the SCIF and see those documents because you said, I don't want to see them, not that helpful, and I don't want to have to try to remember what I'm not supposed to say.
Well, there's the briefings from,
yeah.
And remember, one person finally had an enlightenment for that, and that was Walter.
Yeah.
Because Walter was very much a neocon-like. He was supportive of the wars, and he started shifting his views because of the reading that he was doing. And his simple answer was, I switched when I realized that the briefings were nothing more than lies.
Yeah.
And he was smart enough and principled enough to say, why am I doing this if they're recognized? So, I think that's where we are now. I mean, just think of how many good journalists we have. I think we know all 6 of them.
Yeah, exactly. They're our friends.
Yeah.
Exactly. Speaking of journalism, let's move on because, one of the arguments that we often make is that the mainstream media does not inform American people. Its job is to maintain the narratives, the state narratives. It doesn't tell us the facts, and so most Americans don't know what's going on. And here's a classic example. Put this next one up if you can. This is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Only 3 in 10 Americans were aware of U.S. troops in Syria prior to the deadly attack. And go to the next one. They did a poll. Defense Priorities commissioned a YouGov poll of Americans from January 8th to 15th about the deployment of 900 troops in Syria. Only 3 in 10 Americans responded that they were aware of U.S. troops even being in Syria. So they did a poll, and most Americans had no clue. 7 out of 10 had no clue we even had troops there.
I wish we could do a polling of the people who watch our program and ask them, what percentage of you knew about our troops in Syria?
Yeah.
And what percent of you had a good understanding of how the coup occurred in Ukraine?
Yeah.
Because we did our best with the help of others to get that information out, and more people are listening, even the establishment, because they're backing off on Ukraine. They don't want to be so tied into the Ukrainian mess.
Yeah.
But if you have a principle of non-intervention versus this run-in-the-mill bombing and killing and sanctions, it's like you don't have to be a genius to predict that the trouble's ahead. If nothing else, it's going to be very costly. It's going to be very costly for our national defense and very costly, on our personal liberties. But it all happened. How did you know that?
Yeah.
All you have to do is have a good understanding of what generally governments do to us. 3 military people that were killed. They were the death of 3 members of the Georgia National Guard in Georgia.
Yeah.
I think a proper law would be that the federal government doesn't have a right to go in and just order, state militia up there, because it was enmeshed together. It's all one thing. Everybody thinks the National Guard is part of the federal government. It shouldn't be, and the real militia was a little bit different than that too. I mean, it was meant to defend the state, and that we've lost that notion a long time ago. And I think that. There is one state just recently announced, was it Arizona or somebody said, we're not sending troops if they're called up.
Yeah.
Well, that's another good competition that we like to hear about.
Yeah, well, a lot of our friends are supporting the Defend the Guard Act, which says that unless there's a declared war, the president does not have the ability to move those troops around. I have not read all every aspect of that act, but it sounds good on the surface, so it's a good. And I wanted to just do one more kind of bonus question. This is kind of interesting. This is from that Defense Priorities poll that they commissioned. If you put that next one on, slightly unrelated but but also very interesting. Only 10% of respondents believe Israel should conduct military operations in Gaza regardless of how many civilians are killed or injured. So 9 out of 10 Americans polled in this say they should not have a blank check. The blank check is exactly what President Biden gave them. 9 out of 10 Americans disagree with giving them this blank check. And so that really underscores, I think, the stuff that we've been talking about a lot here on the show, which is this huge divide now between how Americans feel about what's going on in the Middle East and what Biden and his neocons, backed up by the neocon Republicans, feel about it.